The following story is told by my grandfather before he passed away. In the Second World War, my grandfather served in the British infantry. Although he believed that joining the military would allow him to travel to far-off places like Tunisia, Italy, or the Pacific, the young man who enlisted to serve his country ended up practically in his own backyard, Switzerland. He was only about 19 years old at the time. Before reading the rest of this story, it's important to understand that this is just some historical background information. Throughout the war, Switzerland made every effort to uphold its neutral status. Switzerland made an effort to remain neutral, but both the Allied and Axis powers were still very interested in it. The Swiss military received reinforcements from England once the Nazis started attacking Switzerland. However, the Swiss government gave orders to its military, and later, the British reinforcements, to carry out a series of tactical retreats into the Alps in an effort to prevent all-out war within its borders. That's how my grandpa ended up assigned to a small community in the Swiss Alps. It was early winter 1943 at the time, and my grandpa's company was stationed in a remote community of about 500 residents. The fact that it was so difficult to reach and thus had little chance of being accidentally invaded by Nazi Germany was one of their location's advantages. But it was also a drawback because it made coordination with the rest of the Swiss military very challenging. When a series of blizzards that hit the area early in December completely destroyed the few channels of communication they had in the first place, the communication problem was only made worse. Because he was effectively cut off from the rest of the army and stuck in this remote Swiss village, my grandpa's captain decided it would be best to follow standing orders and keep defending the community. Weeks went by. Roads to the outside world were impassable due to the 7-9 feet of heavy snowfall that covered them, and any phone and telegraph lines they did have were also useless. As winter dragged on, trees lost their leaves, and their bare trunks stuck out of the mountainside like broken ribs. The soldiers felt as though they were living in a state of perpetual dusk because the town was tucked between two sizable mountains and only received direct sunlight for a few hours each day. One evening, my grandpa was out at the local bar with a few of his business associates when some neighborhood residents approached them, one of whom was obviously upset. One of the town's Swiss residents, who had all grown up speaking German and were unaccustomed to the presence of Brits, started shouting in shaky English, "Where? Take you? The kids?" Fortunately, one of the guys my grandfather was drinking with was a native German speaker and could serve as an emergency translator. The translator turned to my grandpa and the other soldiers after several minutes of chaos and yelling and said, "They claim that a few of the village children have vanished. They demand that we take action." The British military, however, doesn't exactly operate as a group of mercenaries for hire. So my grandpa and his friends instructed the villagers to return to the headquarters, really just a temporary barracks that they had thrown together in the town's church, to speak with the captain. The villagers' conversation with the captain took about 2 hours because of the language barrier. The captain's self-designated translator was able to piece together the following in essence. The villagers had become aware of a number of strange occurrences a few weeks after the company had arrived in the village. Over the next 2 months, people realized that valuable items were being stolen from their homes. One man claimed that his family heirloom, a handmade ceremonial halberd, which is similar to a traditional Swiss war axe, had vanished from above his fireplace mantel. At first, it was just innocuous stuff like vanishing pieces of wood and tarp from people's sheds. When a village child vanished, all of these incidents came to a head. It goes without saying that a lot of people believed that the boy's disappearance, while tragic and unsettling, could be explained by something as simple as him playing outside and falling into a snowdrift, or by him being attacked and killed by a wolf or other predatory animal. However, more than one child went missing. There were many. The villager who walked into the bar and seemed particularly upset? That man was the father of the 2 little boys who had vanished 2 days earlier. He had looked everywhere for them, even gathered a posse of his town people to help in the search, but they had come up empty-handed and had no idea what had happened to the kids. The captain assured the locals that he would keep looking into the situation and that he would start sending some of his men to patrol the streets at night in search of whoever or whatever, was responsible for all the bizarre robberies and kidnappings. Private Reginald vanished from the barracks later that evening. It was one thing for children to vanish, but a grown man? It didn't seem likely that an animal, not even a wolf, could have killed a healthy adult male by itself. Naturally, rumors started to spread that some kind of monster lived in the mountains and would descend at night to feast on the villagers. The captain ordered nightly patrols, but the disappearances persisted. The victims of whatever was preying on the village were all young children, ranging in age from 5 to 10, with Reginald being the only adult. 7 children, including the first 3 missing children, disappeared from the town in total. The suspicions of many people in my grandpa's company were growing. One theory that was circulated was that poor villagers were actually selling their own children to human traffickers in order to make extra money. Even so, it didn't make sense because there was still snow on the roads leading into and out of the town. Without incident, 3 additional weeks elapsed. By this time, it was early spring and the snow had begun to thaw. Coincidentally, they learned what caused the children's and Reginald's disappearances that night, while my grandpa and a few other soldiers were on patrol. My grandpa and his companions first noticed a figure peering through the bedroom window of one of the villagers' homes sometime after midnight. The person looking out the window initially missed the patrol because my grandpa was at the other end of the street. The prowler yelled at by my grandpa, and the other soldiers tore itself away from the window and started running away. It was universally agreed upon by the patrol that this was the cause of the disappearances and break-ins. In pursuit, they ran as quickly as they could through the melting snow and ice of the night while yelling for whatever it was to stop. Running relentlessly, they eventually found themselves outside the village, where the snow was still quite deep. As the patrol got closer, they realized that the prowler had simply jumped into a cave that had been hollowed out in the side of a snowdrift. The figure appeared to have jumped into the ground. At first, it appeared as though it had vanished into thin air. Several gunshots erupted from the snow cave's entrance as the soldiers shouted into the cave for the figure to emerge and reveal itself. My grandfather and the other members of the patrol immediately drew their weapons and started shooting into the gaping hole. Silence. They waited for a short period of time that seemed to last for hours. One patrol member, who was incredibly brave, volunteered to investigate the cave, pulled his gun, knelt down, and crawled inside. He emerged a few seconds later with the most horrified look on his face. When my grandpa discovered the gory explanation for the strange events in the town, he pulled out his flashlight and shone it into the cave. Reginald, the private who had gone missing weeks earlier, was the figure they had been searching for. Reginald had been fatally shot in the heart. The bodies of 7 partially eaten children were also present in the cave along with Reginald. Reginald had gone completely insane and had started breaking into the villagers' houses and snatching their children from their homes in the middle of the night, either as a result of the stress of being snowed in for the entire winter, living in nearly constant darkness, or some sort of terrible mental issue. After slitting the children's throats and hiding them in the cave he carved into the snowdrift, he had used the halberd that had been reported missing to dismember the bodies. During World War II, my grandpa was stationed in the Swiss Alps and ended up stranded in a small village. Children started to vanish from the community. It turned out that one of the soldiers from his company who had gone missing was actually kidnapping the kids and eating them in a secret snow cave he had built outside the town. My grandfather was an exceptional man. Born into crushing poverty, he took to a life of crime in his teenage years before straightening up and joining the British Indian Army, where he served with distinction. After India's independence, he won multiple national-level gold medals in wrestling, subsequently completed his education, and started a successful trucking company. He had lived such an extraordinary life that he spent his old age just reliving his memories with friends and family through his great storytelling skills. We grandkids just loved to sit around him as he regaled us with tales from his well-lived life. He always seemed so joyful when he did it too, but there was this one story that he avoided telling any of us until he was almost on his deathbed. one story has stayed with me, even after all these years. I remember it all like it just happened yesterday, how his eyes widened and his bony hands trembled in fear as he recounted the most frightening experience of his life. Thankfully, I had a tape recorder close at hand, and I can tell you what he told me in his exact words. Are you sure you want to record this? Because it's not very pleasant. Okay then. Just don't tell your mother what I tell you here. I don't want to be held responsible for any nightmares you might end up having because of this. So all this happened back in 1942, in the midst of the Arakan campaign. The Japanese had pushed all the way into Burma. Myanmar. The campaign was the first offensive push by the Allied army to push the Japs back. And let me tell you, it was a spectacular failure. We were not prepared for the attack. Remember, this was back when Indians couldn't rise to the rank of Subedar Major, and all command posts were occupied by the British. And they had no idea what the fuck they were doing. They had little to no experience fighting in the muggy jungles, and our transport infrastructure, our supply lines, were pathetically weak. Hell, Bengal, that was supposed to be the launch pad for the invasion, suffered a devastating famine just a year later. I'm sure you must have read about that in school. The Japanese, on the other hand, were well fortified and carried out ambushes on a regular basis. It wasn't surprising to have entire patrol squads get wiped out in the blink of an eye. The attackers would suddenly appear out of the shadows and disappear before help could arrive. It was terrible. We were on edge all the time. Every branch that snapped, every leaf that rustled, got our fingers pushing against the trigger of our rifles. Compounding all that were the harsh conditions. We were far more likely to be killed by disease than by war. The food we ate was barely enough to keep us on our feet, and the threat of malaria and dysentery always loomed large. Snakes, spiders, and other insects, larger than anything we'd ever seen, crawled on our emaciated bodies as we slept. Swarms of flies that looked like dark little clouds descended on the corpses of our brothers. It was hell. We were permanently covered in layers of dirt. Rain lashed the forest at an alarming frequency, turning the weather so humid that it felt like our skin was starting to melt. The repeated spells of rain pretty much destroyed our communication lines, and the ground had turned so boggy that some soldiers had gotten stuck in them, right up to their thighs. It was so bad that at times the command structure had completely broken down, and disorganized chunks of the army were operating almost independently from each other. It was in such a situation that nightmare appeared in our lives. One of the worst aspects of fighting in the jungle was psychological warfare. The Japs would kidnap our soldiers, torture them for information, brutalize them beyond what should be humanly acceptable, and send them back, barely clinging to life. We could never save them, and I think that was the point. To watch our comrades, our brothers in arms, waste away in front of us, while our meager medical supplies could do nothing to help them. But that wasn't the worst of it. You see, one thing they delighted in doing was using our soldiers as bait to draw the rest of us out. They would torture our soldiers to the brink of death and tie them up to a tree, usually in a clearing, and hide in the forest. If we went out to help, they would pick us off from the trees. All we could do is just stay hidden and listen to the agony-filled death throes of our fellow soldiers. Wait till the last drop of life is slowly squeezed out of them as they cry out for their mothers. It was one such incident that changed everything, or at least an incident that looked deceptively like the nightmare that we had gotten used to. James Wavell, a distant relative of Archibald Wavell, the then commander-in-chief of the British Indian Army, and later viceroy, was in charge of us. He was the one who sent us out on patrol that day. There were about a dozen of us, cutting our way through the jungle when we heard the screams. You see, in forests, it's actually quite hard to track down the source of a loud noise like that. If someone screams, it feels like it's coming from everywhere, like the woods are echoing the sound and speaking to you themselves. But not this time. Instinctively, almost on a primal level, we knew where the screams were coming from, and almost as if in a daze, we gripped our guns tight in our hands and followed, or more likely, we were led there, if that makes any sense. It didn't take us long to find the man who was screaming. He was dressed in Indian Army fatigues, or at least the trousers. His shirt was torn and hanging from his shoulders. He was, God, this is hard. He was tied to a tree and had his hands on his stomach, trying to push down his intestines that were spilling out like thick, bloody little ropes. And his screams, it's like I can still hear them, like they're still making my ears ring. I could feel the pain in those screams in my bones. I began walking toward him before I even realized what I was doing. I felt a hand on my shoulder and was pulled back forcefully. I looked into the eyes of the man who pulled me back. They were wide open, alarmed, like he knew something was seriously wrong here. He shook his head slowly, warning me not to go ahead, even as that man continued to scream. I gulped and nodded. We spread out into the woods with our guns drawn, keeping each other in sight, to brace ourselves for the Japanese ambush. I winced as twigs snapped underneath my boots. I realized I was afraid. Not of the Japanese, presumably hiding in the trees somewhere close to us. No, but the wounded man in front of us. It was so bizarre. I can't explain it, but I felt it, deep in my soul. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run away, to keep running until I left this man far behind me. I took up position slightly to the man's left and began waiting for him to die and for whatever it was to end, but it didn't. The man screamed, he cried, he sobbed, he called for help, but he just didn't seem to die. Minutes turned into hours, and the sun began dipping beneath the horizon, but he kept on screaming. We stood rooted to our spots, unable to move, as if mesmerized by the strange performance. The moon climbed up into the sky, and the man's blood began gleaming under the white light that beamed down on him. But he still didn't die. My legs were aching, my neck was stiff, and I could hear someone to my right crying softly in terror. It was like we knew that it was not that man, but we who were about to die. And then it happened. The man stopped crying. Then the world was plunged into silence. And I do mean complete silence. We couldn't hear anything. Anything. No birds, no crickets, and no leaves rustling in the wind. We couldn't even hear ourselves breathing. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then the man got up. He easily tore off the rope holding him in place and jumped up on his feet. His intestines hung limply from his belly, which looked like someone had punched a hole through it. Half his gut was gone. Just straight gone. I could see straight through it. No man can live through an injury like that, let alone be completely fine, like he seemed to be. You see how scared I am right now? Do you see how my hands are trembling, even after all these years, just by thinking about that night? So you can imagine just how terrified I was when that man glared at me. His eyes shot up to mine like he knew where I was, like he'd always known where I was. There was such malice in his eyes that I almost passed out from the fear. And then he screeched. It was loud and shrill, like thousands of babies screaming into our ears. I remember quaking in my boots just looking at that hateful snarl on his face. He began running towards me, with these big, loping strides covering half the distance within seconds. Thankfully, that sudden burst of motion had restored my senses, and I started running away from him. I dropped my gun, my backpack, and just bolted. I leapt over small rocks and overgrown roots, ducked under branches, waded through thickets, stumbled in the dark, but kept on running. My boots at one point got stuck in the soggy mud, but I pulled myself free and pumped my legs to keep running. I stole a glance over my shoulder and saw him gaining on me, his intestines slapping against his thigh as he ran. He was smiling, ear to ear, like the chase was the best thing to have ever happened to him. Like he wanted to take his time and truly savor the hunt. Move, move, move. Must go faster, I thought. I heard screams behind me, accompanied by loud tearing and squelching sounds. He was ripping the patrol squad apart, one by one, and soon it was going to be my turn. My lungs were on fire. Each breath was a desperate act of survival. My legs were starting to wobble. I knew I would not last long. I couldn't outrun him, but I could hide. I found this small crevice where this giant tree had been uprooted, tucked away in a dark corner of the woods. I scrambled for the tiny hole and cloaked myself in the shadows. I wasn't even thinking about snakes or some other venomous creature waiting for me in the dark. I just wanted to get the fuck away from that thing. I pulled my knees close to my chest, felt my heart hammering against my sternum, and waited. I waited for that thing to find me and put an end to it all. I heard his footsteps. Slow, deliberate, felt the leaves shift and crunch underneath his bare feet. Then he began whistling. It was oddly melodious, like a bird singing an ode to the forest. I heard the fallen tree creak as he stepped on it and glided towards me. Dark drops of blood came crashing down on the ground, inches from my feet. He called for me, in my mother's voice. She had been dead for over 5 years by that point. Gently, with love, he called for me and laughed when I didn't move. I put my hands on my helmet, pulled it down in front of my eyes, and began crying as silently as I could. It was over. I knew I was going to die, but for some odd reason, he didn't kill me. Maybe it's because he wanted to leave one survivor alive, to go out and talk about him, and to spread the terror he had inflicted on our patrol squad. I don't know. I don't even know when he left. I spent the whole night there, alone, shivering in that little hole. Even when the sun had come up and bathed the forest floor with light, I still refused to come out. Such was the extent of my fear. It wasn't until another patrol came across me that I felt safe enough to come out. They had to carry me back on a stretcher. I was delirious with fear, and every muscle in my body was exhausted. But I was alive. That was the closest I came to that thing. But that wasn't my only encounter with it. All throughout my stay there, I heard stories about it, from my own regiment and others. Hell, even the Japs had supposedly run across it. This immortal thing that imitated voices, pretended to be wounded, and tore apart entire squads at a time. Or how he came to you at night, when you were sleeping, whispering utter hatred into your ears, before dragging you away and slicing you to pieces. Some patrol squads discovered the remains of corpses in odd places, like decapitated heads on top of trees or limbs splayed out in strange patterns near the base camp. At one point, we feared we were losing more men to that thing than to the Japanese. I'm sure they felt the same. All the horrors that I witnessed in that country, the air bombings, the disease, the burnt corpses, were all nothing compared to that night. I remember how relieved I felt when we marched into Rangoon. Even with all the guns and artillery going off around me, all I could think of was that I was glad I was out of that damn forest. Thank you for your time, fellow thrill seekers. As we have come to the end of today's stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Stay safe and always be aware of your surroundings.